Cool. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today. It is getting a bit warmer in DC, which is very nice, but you are here to learn more about our recent report, World-Class American Transit. Um, uh, we're really excited to share this report. We think it's a really foundational piece that'll allow us to better advocate for world-class transit in communities across the country. But first, let's share a little bit about Transportation for America. So, T4A is a national nonprofit working to create a transportation system that safely, affordably, and accessibly connects everyone to jobs, services, and opportunities through diverse travel options. Transportation for America is a program of Smart Growth America. It's the transportation arm. And just so everyone's on the same page, Smart Growth is an approach to building neighborhoods that provides people with different types of housing at affordable levels, ways to get where they need to go, both in and out of a car, and puts the things they need close by to where they live. On the screen, you'll see our three priorities of Transportation for America that guides a lot of the work that we do. And this report falls squarely in the priority invest in the rest, which is talking about how we have invested over the last 50, 70 years in a transportation system that primarily serves vehicles and moving people fast in vehicles. Um, and so before I hand it off to Corrigan, who's the colleague who wrote the report, I wanted to sort of set us up to talk about why we're here. So when we set out to work on the report, we asked ourselves what it would really take to deliver world-class transit. In the US, that's transit that's fast, frequent, and reliable. And we looked at urbanized areas with populations over 50,000. And for this report, more importantly, we asked how much that would cost. And so with that, I'm going to pass it off to
Cool.
Salerno, Policy Manager, who will lead us through this webinar. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And yeah, as you said, I'm Corrigan Salerno, policy manager with T4A here. So I'm gonna just run us through the report and talk a little bit about some of the context, as kind of Eric really perfectly framed up what we're trying to achieve in the study and really what those results kind of look like and how you can also explore those results to apply them to your own area. So to start, I think it's important to discuss where we're at in our transit spending today. Taking a look historically at this percentage of spending chart that we have actually from the Congressional Budget Office, transit has really not made up a huge share of federal spending and also state and local spending. This chart here is for state and local. But for federal spending, it's really kind of a similar picture in that the federal government really led much more strongly on highway investment for decades, starting, of course, in 1956 with Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Bill. And it really continued on with the federal transportation program taking the lead on highway spending policy, with states falling behind, and then also shoring up a very large portion of that funding. But with transit, not nearly as close to that. And you see that today. So this is some spending data just on the 2023 levels of spending for highways, mass transit, aviation, et cetera. Um, Transit falls an order of magnitude below highway spending. So this is from all sources, including federal, state, and local. As you can see, transit, we're still not really spending of even half of what's being spent today on mass transit. And this is kind of built up over time to be a significant deficit of infrastructure investment for transit and also fleet investment in transit. And that's something that really is what we used as kind of the benchmark to this report is transit fleets, because fleets are really essential to uh, the core things about transit and how it connects people to jobs and services. And to do it effectively, you need to have good coverage, and you also need to have good frequency to get people when they want, where they need to go, when they want to go someplace. So what do our transit fleets look like today? So we took a look at how many buses, trains, and metro vehicles were running in each urbanized area in the United States. And we took a tally of that and tried to contextualize how much that might be per resident. And for instance, we used a per 100,000 resident kind of figure here. As you can see, New York City, of course, really is much higher than a lot of these other places in the United States. Really, the top three cities would be Chicago, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Boston, those sort of cities that we're kind of all familiar with as delivering good transit in the United States. But what does that mean compared to our global peers? What does world-class transit look like? So, taking a look at our different neighbors across the world, we evaluated how many vehicles they had in their own transit fleets, taking stock of different types of vehicles, so buses, trains, etc., per their own population in similar geographic spreads. So we looked at the regional level for these different countries, thanks to data compiled by the International Association of Public Transport on their website, City Transit Data. So this really served as a great benchmark for what transit is being delivered in these other countries as a function of their fleet size. And one thing that we think is pretty consistent across this cohort of cities is that they all each deliver world-class transit service. And similarly, the average for transit service in all of these places is over 130 vehicles per 100,000 residents. So when you take a look at how that stacks up compared to the United States, we're falling pretty drastically short. American cities, we have about 27 transit vehicles for the average American resident. The average city itself is really falling behind. And even our top 10 cities, it's really highly skewed by New York City. But there's only about 36 transit vehicles per 100,000 residents in the top 10 urbanized areas, whereas the world-class average is really high above us in at 133 vehicles per 100,000 residents. And it's fairly consistent across these different areas across the globe. So, how do we actually get to world-class transit in the United States? So, we decided to set some targets for that transit service, the 100 or the vehicles per 100,000 people, and set them according to the density of different US urbanized areas. And here we just have a table on how we set those targets versus where they were performing today. So, those urbanized areas in the lower percentile density had a little bit lower of a target, but they were much higher than their existing performance and would get us to really drastically increased transit service for each urbanized area. So we also had to have some guiding assumptions on how much this might cost us. And that was governed a lot by a lot of the great research in the space around transit costs, specifically from the Transit Cost Project and Transportation Center. They've been doing a lot of great work recently, putting together costs on how much individual vehicles or different miles of right of way might cost. And that also kind of gets us into some of the assumptions that we had on construction for each mile of right of way, which I'll get into in a second. But one other thing that we also evaluated in this report was we went through national transit database data to understand how much it might cost to operate one vehicle operating at maximum service over a year, taking a look at that operating cost and then dividing that by the number of vehicles in the fleet, thinking about how adding one additional vehicle might change that cost. We actually chose to assume that there weren't any economies of scale with this. So some of those operations costs in this projection might be a little high, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that later too. We also have these assumptions here on how much each individual vehicle costs, and that's from evaluating some recent procurement data and the per vehicle cost for each of these types of vehicles. And for construction of fixed guideway right-of-ways, so that's anything from bus rapid transit to new light rail or heavy rail lines, we made an assumption that effectively approximated how many vehicles would be if a urbanized area in their growth to reach a target for world-class transit acquired enough vehicles to effectively constitute a new line of service. So, for instance, on the Red Line in DC, there's about 120 metro vehicles running on that 25-mile line of track or 27-mile of track. We just made an assumption that in those areas, if you're going to be acquiring a whole metro line worth of vehicles, you're going to build a new metro line. So, and that kind of stays consistent for each of these different capital assumptions for fleet procurement. So that all stacks up to reach these different targets that we set for each urbanized area. That amounts to really drastically increased investment required to reach that level, and that's accounting for uh, the baseline level of investment that we're hitting today to maintain the current fleet size, the capital needed to expand the fleet, the dollars needed to pay the workers and pay for the fuel to run that transit frequently, and then also how much that new maintenance would cost per vehicle. So at the end of our scenario, by the final year, we would be tripled our spending to finish out that capital construction that we call for in this report. And across the board, this is really drastically increased spending. Much of it would be coming from building out the dedicated right-of-way that would allow for transit to be running fast and frequently without having to conflict with traffic. And a good portion of that itself, too, would be from the transit vehicles in this capital split of funding that we are describing. If you take a look here, we have some of the data just on what we think the individual fleets for buses, light rail, heavy rail, and commuter rail vehicles, how that would need to grow based on where we're at today. And if you think about this, if we're running buses every 30 minutes and world-class transit means running buses every 10 minutes, this is kind of exactly the level of fleet growth you would need to achieve that world-class level of service in the different urbanized areas across the country. So we would need to really triple the number of buses in service to get there. And buses really remain the backbone for transit in the United States. And it's not too surprising, I think, that that would be the largest increase that you would expect in this scenario. So with the different fleets being added, we would need to really drastically increase the number of track. This would be us calling for approximately doubling the miles of track dedicated to transit. So this would include everything from dedicated right-of-way for buses, as well as new mileage for commuter rail, light rail, and heavy rail, really drastically increasing over time. And we've got some visualizations of this on the capital side of our world-class transit website. And as for operations costs, again, this is all based on existing costs for operations. So we aren't assuming anything like as you operate a larger fleet, you get better at operating it, or different technological advancements that might happen over the next 20 years that would potentially reduce the cost of transit operations. This is just assuming a baseline costs of 2023 and extrapolating those out in real dollars into the future, how much that would actually cost to achieve this world-class service based on each individual vehicle, how much it would cost to run. And then also for the maintenance, one part of this study that we really wanted to account for was what it would take to eliminate the maintenance backlog. So we looked at the conditions and performance report, the 25th edition that US DOT released recently in 2024, as well as some updates to see how much we would actually need to be spending over existing levels to entirely eliminate the state of good repair backlog for transit stations and transit vehicles. So this maintenance backlog doesn't just include the costs for the new vehicles and how much it costs to repair those that are in service today, but also to eliminate the maintenance backlog that kind of makes transit a little bit harder to deliver today, and we really need to address in order to ensure that service is able to run frequently without disruptions based on things like old stations falling apart. So this would address that as well in this scenario for spending. So one component that we're going to also share is just how we were able to split this off by urbanized area. So I'm going to try sharing here. We broke, since our spending was broken down by each urbanized area, we're able to take a look at one, what is happening at the US today, and then also where they would need to, where each urbanized area would need to grow, or how each urbanized area would need to grow to hit these different targets, as well as what those targets look like today. So I'm going to take a look at the Q&A in case there's anything specifically, but if folks want to drop in the chat if there's any one urbanized area they want to take a look at here, we could do that. It'll give us a second there. Atlanta. Let's check out Atlanta. So Atlanta, I think we all know, has a lot of work to do to get towards world-class transit. And one thing that really stands out to us is that it would require us to triple or more than triple the investment required to hit this target. Or today, in the whole Atlanta urbanized area, there's 15 transit vehicles per 100,000 people, and that accounts for the different agencies that fall in that urbanized area that FTA recognizes. And so we set, based on the density in Atlanta, a target for 50 vehicles per 100,000 people, which really was a dramatic increase to reach. And that would include transit service beyond just Atlanta proper, but really the entire region. So this is what regional in that urbanized area for Atlanta, what that service would look like. And with that, you can take a look at what we're calling for in each urbanized area in terms of each individual bus versus where they're at today. Since we also made this report based on the existing fleets in service today, we weren't assuming that there would be any new types of service introduced. Don't necessarily think Atlanta doesn't need commuter rail. I think that there could be great commuter rail, but that's just kind of how our methodology worked in this case, but this is just our level of magnitude suggestion for what different kinds of services would need to be delivered. And we also have in this here as well what it looks like potentially for purchasing the new different types of right of way and how many miles of right of way would need to be purchased to hit that world-class level. So in Atlanta, we see it's in our study, we think that there should be at least an additional 86 new miles of bus rapid transit, for instance, and 94 for light rail and heavy rail in the region there, expanding off existing systems. We also are able to break out in this the investment increases required for each city or urbanized area, excuse me, to reach that world-class transit level and how much that might cost on average annually. So it would require in Atlanta an increase of 310% based on our scenario here. And this really is something that you can explore for each city. And thanks, Beth, for dropping that in the chat. I'm happy to go through see multiple people kind of dropping in Phoenix. So I'm happy to go through that too. But this is something that we'd really love to hope for people to explore on their own as well and take a look at the data. And we're always also happy to hear feedback just on the presentation of this. And if there's ways we can make this easier for you to integrate into your advocacy. So Sam has a good question in the chat here just about what city might have the easiest time to get to world-class transit. One thing that we're able to do too in this report is categorize the different data. The tables are all interactive. So if you have questions like Sam, you can actually filter this data where some of the cities that would be uh, the closest to world-class transit, you can actually take a look here. And unfortunately, it looks like we had a little bug in this graph during the presentation. So we'll go past these. But for the cities that are actually closest in levels, we actually have some surprises just here for these smaller areas that we think are really close to delivering world-class transit. It's oftentimes college towns, as you can see here, where they deliver really robust bus service in a small urbanized area with a lot of non-drivers already. You're able to see that they're much closer to what might be a world-class transit target than other places because they already deliver they already have a pretty strong constituency of folks that are using transit, often in these college towns. But of the big cities, New York City really is the closest to achieving that world-class transit. level of service, and yeah, it's very close compared to others. Cool. And we can jump into another question on. Let's take a look at Phoenix still. Folks were trying to go through. Yeah, and similarly, Phoenix really has a long way to go in terms of transit that it would need to be built out to get to this world-class level. Their target is actually very high compared to other cities, especially other Sunbelt cities, because Phoenix actually is a lot more dense. I think than folks suspect. It's really in the 80th or higher percentile for density among US cities. So we set it a very high target, and obviously density is really isn't everything when it comes to how transit is delivered or how communities are built, but that's just the heuristic we were using for this survey here. Ian had a chat just on a question here on different transit vehicles have different capacities. Buses carry 40 to 60 people. Heavy rail can carry 1,000 people per vehicle. Does this count for more rail-based systems versus more bus-based systems? So the way we're scaling these fleets up is just based on the existing services delivered in the region itself. And we don't really want to think of this as prescriptive to any place. We think that any of the different communities are probably going to be the most informed on whether or not, if you're doing in your local advocacy work around building out a new line of light rail or new service for heavy rail, et cetera, there's going to be a lot of nuance that might be missed in this since we try to do something from the higher level across the United States. How would it take to get to each region level of service there? Like for instance, with McKinney Frisco in Texas, there's really no fixed route transit service that's being delivered here. So it's really a massive increase that would be needed from zero. So it's something that can't even be expressed as a percentage. And that's the case for a lot of different areas in the United States. With, for instance, with McKinney Frisco, that place has nearly 500,000 people living there. So whether or not that means that they shouldn't have any type of service like light rail in the future, we don't want to say that necessarily, but this is just something to help illustrate the magnitude of investment. And I see one question from Bob just about speaking to the methodology around identifying the urbanized area boundaries, inclusion of overlapping transit systems, and the calculations. So we went through we went through the FTA's National Transit Database data here around that, just from whatever transit system or transit agency was under the umbrella of any specific urbanized area. So whatever urbanized area was attached to that transit agency, we summed that up for each area. So if there was a transit agency that might overlap for two, we may actually miss out on some of those. So in the DC region, for instance, under MARC, the MARC train, that would probably go under the Union Station log there, or perhaps Penn Station. So that might be some nuance in this that's potentially missed. And then also another question, just projecting to 2045, do you account for population growth? Yes. So we do account for population growth. In this, we take a census projection for 2045. However, one thing that is worth noting, we don't actually make any judgments on how each urbanized area loses or gains population. We just assumed a linear growth for each urbanized area to reach that 2045 projection. We really just don't have all the guesses that we'd be able to or all the assumptions we'd need to make for each urbanized area there. So we just decided to keep that simple on the population growth. Delaware transit systems were accounted for in this, but they were falling in under the urbanized area level. So in some of these, as you see, that they're split out in kind of these, or they're not split out, they're actually under these kind of umbrellas for each different urbanized area where they cross state lines. So some of those would be folded in under that, and that's kind of how they're counted. I'm also going to take a look at the Q&A specifically outside the chat. And then This analysis, yeah, it accounts for new vehicles and not specifically, but we do extrapolate out the baseline costs in our capital investments page here. If you'd like to take a look at that, that's just assuming that the baseline investment levels are enough to replace the existing level of transit fleets. And it looks like curious how cities hosting big games like Olympics or FIFA, they may upgrade their systems, but how do they continue to fund the systems for the community once the crowds leave? Yeah, I think that's a great question. And uh, one thing that will definitely need to be looked into is those sustained funding sources. I think with the federal government actually supporting different or supporting those cities recently with some additional funding in the fiscal year 2026 appropriations bill. They did a little bit of support, but that's not something structurally that would need to be taken into account. And one thing that we're hoping to get into in a follow up to this report is really how we can pay for all of this investment and investigating the different types of resources that would need to be uh, brought together between new innovative policies on how to actually build out this transit construction, what type of tax measures might need to be leveraged to get uh, all these new vehicles operating each year, and really finding ways to accompany this build out with development and making sure that all of these new vehicles and services are working in tandem with land use planning and ensuring that as we're building out new lines of transit, we're actually using it to their maximum extent and also capturing the value there to help pay for that future service to really kind of sustain this in a virtuous cycle. And that's something we're really looking forward to doing later this year as we can. Yeah, so we have one question from Lisa. How else do we see this data set and analysis being used? So one thing, or you, I'll read this out in full. So I can see this as being a helpful resource for advocates in terms of quantifying ambition for the transit agencies. So yeah, that's one way we'd love to have people use this. And then also other uses that we could see for this data set is one, this is something that has a snapshot of existing data here, where you can take a look at the top on what we're delivering for transit today in each urbanized area, but it also allows you to do a little bit of comparison between areas. And see where the transit or what transit service might look like in each place. And one thing we could also do is like, what would it take to get to the transit service from Houston to what's being delivered in Chicago, for instance? So that's one thing that we're hoping that with the transit vehicles per 100,000 and some of the assumptions that we have logged here on the capital side and the operations, folks would be able to really do their own analysis on setting their own targets. So, what would it take to get, for instance, Georgia to reach Boston levels of transit service? So, you'd be able to take some of the assumptions that we have in this report and extrapolate from there the different costs that we have and the methodology we lay out in this transit vehicles per 100,000 inhabitants measure and use those to make comparative analyses between folks. And still going through these. Yeah, we got one question just about whether or not we could run this on a statewide basis. So yeah, we could, and that's one thing that you could take this data and sum out the different transit agencies as they operate. And we know we've had a lot of different questions about transit crossing jurisdictional lines. I say count them. That counts. If it's running in the state, we can count. We can double count for each of those. But yes, we would love to do more of that and sum up what each city and or what each urbanized area needs to achieve in one state and do a regional kind of based analysis for this. And that's something that you could actually start based on this data itself. So for California, uh, we can actually even go by CA right there. And you could take a look if we're talking about California, grabbing some of the data that's already in this report as a start, for example, and working from there. And then we have a question just about rural areas too. It's a little tough for this. The data for rural areas that's provided by the National Transit Database isn't as robust as what's provided for um, the urbanized areas that we were able to take a look at, the 450 plus different ones, over 50,000 people. Um, and that's something that we wish we were able to do for this report, but it's still something we think is really important to discuss. But we weren't really able to get into it for this report, unfortunately. But there's plenty of arguments to be made just in favor of delivering world-class transit in rural areas. And we think that there's a path to that as well that we'd like to investigate in the future. John, Morgan has a good question of quantity of transit's important, but so is quality. Do you have measurements for that, like fare recovery or transit mode share? Not in this report, but that is the kind of thing that we would like to get into in the next report where we talk about how to actually get to world-class transit. A lot of that is going to be about figuring out ways to deliver quality transit that really is serving mode share or mode shift specifically as almost a performance measurement and capturing riders. And a lot of that's going to have to also go in tandem with building out new transit service and improving the land use around transit. This is really something that can't really be done in a day. This is something that, as an investment scenario, we think really would require um, really vast change in zoning and land use around transit stations to even realize this and also make it worthwhile, this investment, because this is, there's really no way to understate how this would need to be for a transformational investment like this, how much would actually need to change. Let's going through some of these other questions here. So reducing cost of equipment and making it comparable with international averages, that's one thing that we also too would like to get into on this report. And I can just navigate over here and feel free to navigate around this yourselves, folks. This is all online. We tried to be really open with the data we were using and the different assumptions because we really would love to be corrected. If there's better assumptions to be made, we think this is a public project in a way, and we'd love your feedback on how we can improve this and come up with different targets that are more refined for more useful campaigns that folks are doing for their own advocacy. For the assumptions on these vehicles, I'd say the best resources for folks to take a look at about transit costs is really a transit cost project, as well as the Brookings Institution. They're doing some really good work around what policy changes might need to be uh, made in order to reduce the cost of transit and get to those levels that are achieved in other countries. So, for instance, buses in the United States are really pricey. You can find buses for really half the costs that we've estimated here in this report. We actually set our estimates for buses pretty high at $1 million to account for the different types of buses that might be running in different transit agencies. So, for instance, if it's electric, hybrid, or diesel, we're now on this assumption for the $1 million cost. That's around the price for a hybrid bus now. Recently, we saw prices for the MTA acquiring buses at around $1.2 million per unit recently, which was above what we had as an average for the hybrid buses. So this is something that's already still increasing. So there's a lot of work to be done to reduce that cost. And a lot of that, as I mentioned, is being investigated by those folks that I mentioned and that we cite in this report. So shout out to them. And I do see a question from Glenn around the transit funding mix of cities like London for highways versus bus and rail. That's actually part of the reason why we decided to evaluate these urbanized areas just by the number of vehicles that are in service. It's actually surprisingly difficult to get that sort of data on transit spending sometimes in these different cities. One, of course, there's the language barrier and the capacity issues that might occur from just trying to get all these different languages compiled. But also a lot of American transit data, spending data is very transparent. The National Transit Database is a really good resource for understanding spending and understanding how many vehicles are running, how many are running at peak, what types of vehicles, down to the model and the year that they were built. So there's a lot of stuff like that in terms of the detail that you'd be able to dive into that aren't really available at the international peer level. But one thing that is available here for these cities that deliver world-class transit is the number of vehicles, and really that's the uh, largest takeaway is that even if they're able to spend more effectively, there's a lot more transit just simply being delivered in these places. So, Brian, we don't estimate the workforce expansion necessarily on this. There's some data that we did kind of investigate that early on in the report, but just because there's a lot of questions just about the economies of scale, the arguments that could be made around transit operations, we didn't want to necessarily attach a number there quite yet, but that might be something we look into in the future as we continue to quantify the benefits of this sort of investment in future reports. Gonna check through the Q&A. I've kind of been looking at the chat. Sorry about that, folks. Yeah, so there's one question just about manufacturing capacity. We are not at the state where we need to be to actually build out this level of transit service today, or build out the number of miles needed to reach the world-class transit service. And again, that's something that really needs to be reduced in both costs and also increased in capacity. We have our transportation or our surface transportation reauthorization recommendations on our website at T4A, where we discuss some of what would need to happen to get to that level of capacity. There needs to be a lot more support within the Federal Transit Administration for agencies to deliver capital projects broadly. And there also needs to be more streamlining in terms of what we need to get these costs down for individual buses. For instance, we have recommendations just around bus customization needing to be addressed in surface reauthorization. And then also that would go for the same for different types of vehicles. If we're going to be procuring something to this scale across different urbanized areas, that's something that you could really bring costs down by actually making sure that they're being built to standards. And that's something that we think FTA and the federal government could do work with different states and regions as they deliver it. Lawrence has just a question about North Carolina. So I'm just going to actually interpret that as feedback and see if we can get some of this split into some more easier to explore state level data in the future. Like I said, we're really open to different suggestions and what you think might be useful for this report as we work through it. We're hoping to really kind of continue to use this as a resource to build future analyses and help folks use it in their own advocacy. So having that, yeah, thanks, Lawrence, or yeah, for this suggestion there. Going through some of these old questions that I might have looked past a little earlier. Yeah, so we have some land use questions here from a little bit back. Or how we accounted for the different supportive land use changes, so height, density, walkability, connectivity of the grid. We definitely would need to this is something that we don't really drill down into that level for the each urbanized area. We tried to keep our assumptions pretty simple here for each place. But again, this is something that we think helps kind of illustrate the magnitude needed. We think that if there's any sort of change that might need to happen in this scenario, maybe it's more so on the transit capital costs for new right of way. If you have your own assumptions too, just about what might work best in your region, we hope that there's enough data in this that you can choose whether or not that's something worth incorporating in your arguments, just because we do split out the different types of costs here. So with the right of way, you'd be able to take that out, and that would really not affect some of the other data. And that's kind of one of the more expensive pieces here. So if you think that there's enough right of way in your area, or the land use supported might change, um, it might be more important to change, you can take a look there. And then looking at Bakari's question here, to propose legislation to repeal the Buy America rule for transit vehicles. Maybe that would drive the operation costs of maintaining these vehicles down. So I'm not aware of any proposed legislation in Congress to repeal Buy America, and I don't believe it's under discussion right now. But a lot of different think tanks, such as Brookings, they recently released a report that identified Buy America's current implementation as problematic to the costs of procurement for different buses. So, yeah, and as Julie notes there, it definitely contributed to some of the recent uh, problems with different transit manufacturers, specifically like Proterra, and then also others exiting the market. And yeah, to Sam's point, Baba's not just transportation, so it's pretty difficult to address simply from the transportation side. But there's a lot of arguments to be made that we need to do something different, and it's not necessarily in our transportation or reauthorization recommendations this time around. But this is something that a lot of other folks are evaluating and have seen a lot of room for improvement, we could say. Ian, appreciate the feedback. Yeah, I think Ian, that's some great feedback too. So that's something we could maybe work on to get a more regional to state level split on this. I think that's something that could be really useful in people's advocacy. So um, yeah, I think MPO is probably the way to do it. So we'll see about getting that in future iterations of this report, and then if there's anything that we can do in the future benefits version and funding version of this effort, we'll see if we can split that down there too. So yeah, we want this to mostly be helpful and actually usable. And got some other questions just from Haley here. To the extent that we've worked with policymakers and electeds, what have been the reactions so far? Any surprises? I think I haven't had as a huge amount of different individual socializations, but for the ones that we've done it in so far, a lot of people have been both shocked in both the positive and the negative. So some of these smaller places are kind of surprised that they're closer to that different area and or to that world-class transit service target, and others are kind of not so shocked, but less shocked by, or not so shocked by the fact that they're so short of that level. But it's kind of shocking how little, if you think relative to some of the highway investment that we outlined, you need to actually do to get there. So I'm actually going to transfer back over to our actual slideshow and give it a second to get there. If you actually take a look at what we're investing today in transit versus what we're projected to spend on highways from all levels of government, we're spending effectively more than double on highways over this next 20-year period if we're extrapolating existing funding and existing spending levels. However, even if we were to reach those, all of those individual, all 450 plus urbanized areas, reaching that world-class transit target. So that's places like McKinney, Frisco, Texas, that does not deliver any transit, achieving world-class transit. It still would not cost as much as what we're spending on highways today and what we're projected to spend. So that's one thing we think is really worth illustrating in this analysis. And then we also have an estimate just on reducing the cost of car owner, or the reducing the rate of car ownership by just less than a quarter of a percent each year as a result of this study, or of this investment. You would be able to save over $5 trillion in household expenditures, more than paying for this investment when it comes to each individual household savings. So, and that's also in the report there as well. And we're hoping to break this data out more with regional partners. Right now, I'm actually working with folks in the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance on some work in the Baltimore area. So I'm happy to partner with folks as they, if they're interested as well, to kind of break out this data and make it a little bit more translatable to that local level. And thanks, Ian. I see you in the chat there too. So would love to, happy to work with you there. All right. And final questions, just would love to give another 5 minutes to that if folks are interested. But otherwise, that's all we have. All right, Gary. Every city and region in the US or in Europe, 400, 500,000 population is exceptional, cost-effective LRT and tram service. The US is way behind. What lessons can be applied to American projects? We'll have to investigate those kind of questions, and we're hoping to take a look at those in the next version of this report, where we're able to really do the deep dives in the how. We kind of know the sticker price for world-class transit as a result of this report. What we want to figure out in the next steps is one, how do you finance it and how do you actually get discounts to that sticker price? And a lot of that is going to be around the governance that's needed to actually get there, and then also the land use changes, the practices in terms of planning that would need to occur, and the cultural changes that would need to happen also in these different agencies across the country to reach this level of ambition. But really, we wanted to stake a claim here around the level for world-class service because I think a lot of areas are trying to achieve world-class transit service. We need to understand that there's a magnitude difference that we need to bridge, and any additional service that we are able to deliver towards world-class is a huge and important step. But the actual world-class service is really high and above what we're doing today. So if we're going to really strive for that, I think we need to understand what that target is, and it's very achievable in a lot of places. Lawrence, really glad to hear that the LRTP is lining up with what our expectations are here too. So, and that's one thing that we're hoping can be useful just as a kind of short, like back of a hand napkin type calculation um, for those levels of transit vehicles for every 100,000 people. We're hoping that this can help make those arguments really simple, especially simple for policymakers. This is something that we're hoping really anyone can understand. I was able to explain this to my mom, which was great. So if you're able to explain it to somebody who doesn't work on this, we're hoping that it keeps things simple. All right, y'all. Thank you. So I think we're going to wrap it up here. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. My email is corgan.salerno@transportationforamerica.org. So I'm going to put that in the chat. All right. Thanks, folks.
Thanks everyone for joining us today, and thanks so much, Corrigan, for the great presentation. Hope everyone gets a chance to dig deeper into the report.
Thanks, y'all.